All right, we're gonna go get started. I promised a 4-year-old that I would be done soon enough for her to play with me before she has to go to bed. So, um, thanks again for everybody coming. I see lots of instructors here tonight, so hopefully this polling will go well. Not that it's too challenging. So I'm going to start things off with a little poll. Excuse me. So let's go with that. 1 second, let me get that rolling. Okay, let's see here. Well, crud. Polling is not working tonight like I was hoping it would. So let's see. We're going to have to come back to that and see if I can't solve that problem in the meantime. Let's go ahead and talk about what our intention is tonight. My intent is not to just talk about special use airspace from the what, but more from the why. Lots of people, certainly especially people in here, know what the why is. What we're more predominantly concerned with, what the what is, we're more predominantly concerned with kind of the why tonight as far as what's going on inside of that airspace, and therefore why does it dictate the restrictions that perhaps it does. So we're going to go through all special use airspace, other use airspace. And so in conjunction with that, we'll talk about each individual element. We'll give examples, of course, by jumping into ForeFlight, taking a look at different methods that we can get additional information about that particulars. As well, we'll also, if we have time left over, I'm going to go right up to 8:30, but if we have time left over, I do want to talk about something that we consistently see on the progress checks as far as confusion with airspace goes, and that's predominantly associated with the issues between all the differentiations between Class G and Class E interactions. It's actually more simplified these days in actuality compared to what we see technically on paper. In other words, they've removed a lot of the Class G airspace out there that extends really much beyond 1,200 feet. To where there's really not a whole lot of that left in the entirety of the country. So if we have time, we're going to get into that. But our mainstay focus is certainly going to be on special use airspace to kind of remove some of the mystique about what is special use airspace. So since my polling is falling apart, and I still haven't been able to resolve that, we'll go ahead and jump into it. I do want to follow up with a question at the end, and I guess you'll have to ask yourself this for now because it was part of my polling, but I want to find out what kind of airspace this particular picture could be taking place in. I have some insight and foreknowledge because I know the person who's flying this airplane, so I know where this is located and an association what type of airspace they were in. With that being said, certainly want to see if people can gauge where this likely would be occurring. And we'll get into, of course, the different types of airspace that would at least give us some idea of what this is occurring in. So if you have no clue, good, because we're going to talk about it. If you have an idea, that's perfectly fine too. If you know exactly what type of airspace it is, you probably don't, because in fact, this could actually take place in a couple of different types of airspace, though I guess the picture itself kind of gives way to some ideas if you pay careful or close attention to things. So with that being said, let's jump right into it. Excuse me 1 second, just get a drink of water to avoid what happened last time. Okay, so first of all, why are we concerned with special use airspace, I guess would be the first concern. First of all, one of the things I like to try to simplify as far as just a generalized description of all types of airspace, whether we're talking about classes of airspace, controlled, generally in relation to uncontrolled, talking about special use airspace, there's no exception that generally all airspace is purposed for separating participating and non-participating aircraft. Yes, there's some exceptions to that, but to generally understand the purposes of all airspace, if you think about it, there's a reason why that airspace is there. It's largely to separate participating and non-participating aircraft. So special use airspace is largely no exception for that. We don't run into special use airspace often enough even in Florida, where there's a decent amount of activity going on, both from the civilian as well as the military aspect. And so because of that, I think that oftentimes for the average user, it becomes or seemingly inconsequential. Maybe even disregarding a safety matter concern, we do still have that aspect of, well, if you have no clue what's going on inside of that airspace, then you have no interpretation, of course, of how the best way is to go about handling that. So keep in mind that lots of these airspaces that we're going to discuss may be literally a one-off for you, especially if you remain, say, in a consistent region like the Southeast, for example. However, it's that one-off time that is more than likely, of course, where you can find yourself in a situation that you don't want to be. And I've heard some stories that I'll allay from discussing where people have inadvertently flown into airspace and things have gotten exciting. So let's jump into some specific airspace, starting off, excuse me, with the military operations area. And start off with talking about what we can see or expect to possibly see inside of a military operations area from there, and then talk about whether it really does affect us, what our decision making is and involved in that. We'll take some time to delve into AIM 3-4-5. If anyone's ever watched any of these sessions or attended them live, you know that I try to stay away from just presenting a slideshow to you guys. So we're going to do some investigating as per usual associated with whatever type of airspace we're talking about. To start off, what are MOAs if you're unfamiliar? The primary purpose is to separate non-participating IFR traffic, which would largely be pretty much every type of IFR traffic, from military training activities. That being said, even during active military operations areas, if they can route IFR traffic through a particular area, they might do that, but largely you would expect that that's not going to be the case. So IFR traffic out there, if you know there's an active MOA, you might as well treat this like a restricted area. You're not going to be cleared through it in most cases. So if you're planning a route of flight, then you know that this is a place that, of course, you would benefit by, of course, planning around either vertically and or laterally. But let's talk about, before we go into VFR considerations, what we expect to see in there. All different types of things, from air combat tactics, including dogfighting, as it's generally called, where we have two types of situations that could, of course, be occurring: low altitude as well as high altitude air combat tactics, where they could be training, of course, at low altitude as well as at high altitudes. Air intercepts, which, yes, that doesn't mean a military aircraft intercepting another military aircraft. They can, and in fact will, practice intercepting aircraft inside the MOA, and from my own personal experience, outside the MOA. Aerobatics, of course. Specifically, though, of course, civilian aircraft can practice aerobatics. What we're really talking about in this situation, if we want to put it into a nutshell, is that most military training operations certainly are going to be restricted in the same regard that civilian operations are, i.e. any regulation that governs us generally governs them, with the exception of an MOA in these regards. So, for example, you may not be familiar with aerobatic legal restrictions, but for one aspect of aerobatics is that you cannot perform aerobatics below 1,500 feet above the ground. And that would be the same case for military operations, especially training operations, except within an MOA. So they can be doing low altitude aerobatics. They can be doing aerobatics within 4 nautical miles of a Victor airway, as another example. So if you were to see a Victor airway depicted through a military operations area, generally you would expect that no one should be doing aerobatics within 4 nautical miles of that Victor airway on either side, as long as they're, of course, complying with the legal restriction. But that would not be the case necessarily inside of an MOA. So you may fly through a military operations area on a Victor airway and expect that you'd be good as far as aerobatics are concerned. That would not be the case in this situation. Certainly formation training, of course, low altitude tactics goes beyond just aerobatics. They could, of course, be practicing low altitude flight as far as navigation goes. Certainly high speed flight. The DoD is authorized to exercise high speed flight in excess of 250 knots below 10,000 feet inside of these MOAs. And then there are some MOAs that are approved for lights out operations, which means kind of like the picture we see here in the background at night. They could be doing a training mission where they will turn all their exterior lights out. They will use night vision goggles in conjunction with heads-up displays and fly the airplane in low lighting, and certainly no external lighting for the aircraft situations, which would certainly make them hard to see for our part. So before we go on, let's jump into the the aim real quick. And let's do some investigating just beyond, of course, what we summarized so far. So again, this mainly is benefited for your purposes. Excuse me. Seems like it's already starting. Okay, so AIM Chapter 3 is what we're looking for. In this case, as you see on the left-hand side for my device, we're going to go to AIM Chapter 3. And we're looking for, in this case specifically, Special Use Airspace. And then we're looking at Military Operations Area, which is paragraph 5. Now, I largely, of course, describe what you would mostly see in this section here thus far. But let's emphasize really what it boils down to for VFR aircraft. Are we restricted to fly through these areas under VFR operations? If we think about the type of activity that we've discussed, is it inherently dangerous to fly through an inactive MOA? Well, yes, I would say that you definitely have an increased risk. And as I'll tell you a little bit later, there are certainly some situations that complicate matters when it comes to collision avoidance on both sides of the coin, meaning not just you looking for a military aircraft, but that military aircraft looking for you. But the question is, are we prohibited? And we can see if we go back to the definition, the main definition again at the top there is whenever an MOA is being used, non-participating IFR aircraft may be cleared through an MOA if IFR separation is provided by ATC. Otherwise, ATC will reroute and restrict non-participating IFR aircraft. Here's the key. Excuse me. That doesn't, of course, have any designation for VFR aircraft. So the answer is we can fly through these if we so choose. The concern, of course, obviously, is with these type of activities going on, it's going to be difficult for them to be looking for us. And of course, our speed differential is another thing to consider. If they're going to be operating in speeds of excess of 250 knots, 350, 400, 450, 500 knots, certainly we have an issue with speed difference where there's going to be a high rate of convergence, even if we're going the same direction. So even though we can fly through an MOA, clearly, obviously, it's best that we choose to avoid it. That being said, let's take a look at an example. So here we are at Orlando. Most people are familiar with this area, and I'm going to make heavy use of it just because it's got a lot going on. No exception, of course, when we talk about the MOA. Now, what we really see here is a multitude of different types of special use or other use airspace, all converging generally in the same area. Largely, what we'll talk about here in a little bit is this specific area here. So, but what we see surrounding the entirety of the area is a group of 2 military operations areas. Now, if you're using 4 flights, you can interrogate that airspace by kind of pressing and holding. Unfortunately, the window drop down kind of covers up the area, but you can see, at least on the outset, that it's highlighted there. If I push it over here, it's a little easier to see that way, but all I've gotten is kind of the restricted areas at that point, technically highlighted. Well, I guess I've got the MOAs as well, actually. So we're going to look specifically at the Palatka 1 MOA. 4 flight gives us some immediate information of its vertical extent. So we can see there, Palatka 1 MOA is 3,000 to 17,999 feet. So, of course, MOAs never go beyond what we see as far as this VFR sectional goes. So up to, but not including Class A airspace. Now, if we press the details button, we may get some further information. In this case, we see the activation is non-continuous. However, it is intermittent, as we see under hours. Specifically, it's intermittent anytime, therefore, from 800 to 2,400 hours daily. What does that mean? That means that we don't know is the best answer.
because that means that it could be active at any point in time during that time frame. And of course, that would be daily, 7 days a week, then technically 365 days a year. Other times outside of that spectrum, i.e. from midnight, in other words, or 2400 to 800, it also could be active, and in that case, it should be active by a NOTAM. But what that therefore tells us is if you were expecting to see a NOTAM for this activity anytime between 8 a.m. and midnight, that's not going to be the case. The only way, therefore, to determine its activity during its normal intermittent hours is, of course, contacting the controlling agency, which we see listed simply as FAA Jacksonville Air Route Traffic Control Center. You may also, of course, try other facilities, but there's no guarantee that they would know for sure. You would have an expectation also, however, that flight service would be able to obtain that information for you as well. But the go-to control agency in this case would be Jacksonville. Now, to further delve in just a little bit beyond this, for those of you who don't know this, you can go to the source by using, again, I know we're heavy on the ForeFlight feature, but that's what most of us use. If we go to the gear symbol here at the top, which represents settings, and we scroll down to the bottom, we press the map touch action, we can bring the original chart to the front with legends by pressing that last option. So again, just map touch action, press the bottom option there, and that will bring up the chart once I tap on the area, which I already done. So now you can see the original paper sectional in this case. And what we're looking specifically for, I can already tell where it is in this chart, is I'm looking for that magenta text. So if we zoom in here, we're looking specifically, in this case, if we scroll back up, for the Palatka 1 MOA. Try not to lead too far ahead of the lag on the video. So we zoom into Palatka 1 MOA, and guess what? It pretty much gives us the same bit of information that we saw that ForeFlight did for us. So looks like they got it right. Palatka, both 1 and 2 MOAs are both from 3,000 feet. Notice they don't give us an altitude for the tops, so therefore we presume that it's the highest altitude that a MOA can go to, 17,999 feet. Of course, this is again intermittent from 800 to 2,400, and the controlling agency is Jacksonville Center. What they didn't give us was a frequency to contact them by. There are a couple different solutions. I'm going to give you perhaps what some people consider to be more of an obscure solution, but that's again to kind of show you other documents that we always can make use of. Does ForeFlight provide this solution for us, for example? If we go back to this location, at least directly here, the answer, as you can see, would be no, they didn't give us a frequency. What if we try the Jacksonville FIR, Flight Information Region, as it's short for, TACOM Communication Details? Well, yes, they did give us frequencies, except they gave them, of course, across the entire area. So you would generally have to know the geographical area. This, of course, is near Ocala, kind of near Gainesville, between that and Daytona Beach. So if we're looking in through Jacksonville to Daytona Beach, did they give us a frequency for Daytona? They did. It's discrete on 134.0, so you might try that. You might also try, excuse me, the Gainesville frequencies in that generalized area. Where did this actually come from, however? Well, this came from the chart supplement. So if we go to the Southeast chart supplement, so this is what we're looking at. Of course, make sure that the supplement is current. In this case, started on the 26th, good through of last month, good through the 21st of May. We go to the third page in the PDF, and there's a table of contents that allows us to jump. And we're looking to jump to frequencies associated with specific ATC facilities. In this case, what they gave us is a section for Air Route Traffic Control Center. So I tap on that. Of course, we're looking for Jacksonville. We know that we're in the general Jacksonville Center area. We zoom in, and what do we see? We see pretty much the same type of frequencies. There's Daytona Beach on 134.0. You could try 364.8, but you have to have a UHF radio to be able to do so. So if you're trying that on a VHF, you're going to find you're going to get frustrated once you get to 136 on the megahertz dial, and then it's just going to back up to its lowest value. So any UHF band radio number that you think looks kind of odd, that you've never seen before, that's for good reason, because that's a UHF band frequency. You won't be able to use those. So you're looking for the numbers that lead with a 1 in front of the following digits. So that would be our best bet as far as just estimating the frequency in that area. Once again, we have shown that ForeFlight has kind of done the legwork for us if we know where to look in this case. So again, if I'm looking specifically in the Jacksonville FIR, which of course goes from the surface up to but not including Class A airspace, I can get that communication details section here. Again, you've got to know the geography of your area well enough to be able to find this frequency, however. Now, why do we want to call that in the first place? Again, we want to know the activity status of the Palaca 1 MOA. Now, good planning, of course, VFR, is to always plan around it. So your original flight planning presumes that it's going to be active, because once again, if we're flying from 8 a.m. to midnight, there's no way to know really preemptively. Maybe one day where they can give us some type of digital dissemination, but by NOTAM, otherwise at this point, we cannot obtain that information outside of that intermittent, inside that intermittent time frame. There's not going to be a NOTAM necessarily because of the fact that it's just intermittently active anytime from that time to from 8 a.m. to midnight. So we've got to call them in the air, of course, to obtain whether its status is active or not. If it's not active, then of course you have the option of choosing to fly through it. That being said, if it is active, you have the option of choosing to fly through it, but clearly it's not the best idea. And again, I'll kind of touch on that a bit later from a different point of view. So let's move ahead. Let me grab another drink of water so my wife doesn't get me in trouble. Okay. All right, so moving on, let's talk about the next special airspace, in this case, actually alert areas. What are alert areas? Well, you will see some of these around Florida for sure, certainly because of the fact that we have a lot of training. So that gives you clues, of course, to what these are. They incorporate an area or an airspace bounded both vertically usually, but certainly laterally as well for heavy amounts of traffic. Sounds like an area, of course, that, you know, where it's imagining the buzzing bees all over the place, where literally if we had some ability at looking at radar returns or ADS-B or flight tracker, we would see just airplanes all over the place or targets all over the place. And that certainly can be the case. The problem is we don't exactly know what they're all doing. In other words, the flight training is not uniform. This, of course, is kind of a specific exception. So this is an alert area depicted pretty much directly over the top and just to the east of the initial points of the Rocky Mountains for the United States Air Force Academy. So you could have gliders in there, anything from gliding to parachuting to, of course, high-speed aircraft for that matter as well. Once again, the real true question, knowing, of course, that there's a various type of flight training, there's nothing standardized. We're not going to say this is the type of airplane and these are the types of speeds they're necessarily going to be flying in an alert area. We do know that they'll be speed restricted, of course, just like we would normally expect otherwise below 10,000 feet. But outside of that, as we can see specific up in the top left-hand corner, we're requested to avoid flight in the vicinity of the United States Air Force Academy due to intensive student pilot training and parachute jumping surface to up to 17,500 feet mean sea level. And of course, we can get supplement for additional information specifically for the hours of operation. The point is, though, we know nothing really beyond that. It was nice for them to even include the fact that they exercise parachute jumping in that area in addition. But certainly, therefore, in accompaniment, we don't have a clue what type of aircraft, outside of simply the fact that we see there's a glider symbol there as well. So we have some confidence there's going to be glider training. What other types of training, of course, could be going on there, we don't exactly know. So once again, it's an area where, as we can see, we can choose to fly through it, but of course warrants extreme caution. And so once again, let's jump to the AIM real quick. I'm not going to do this for every single one of these. I would recommend that you take notes or certainly rewatch this and review the AIM sections yourself. Admittedly, yes, they are just text, but that text will give you further insight, probably beyond what you generally just knew, which is either, yes, I can fly through that, no, I can't, and a very basic idea of what's going on there. With the alert areas, there's not a whole lot more when it comes to the AIM section admittedly, but nonetheless. So we'll scroll a little bit further down now for military operations areas, the next section, paragraph 6. And yeah, it's a lot shorter. It's very simple in its approach because, again, there's a variety of training there. Generally, we don't expect, of course, the same type of operations in an MOA, because, again, we just saw that those would be normally otherwise illegal outside of an MOA. So we don't expect low-altitude aerobatics necessarily. We don't expect certainly high-speed flight in excess of 250 knots. But there is still that emphasis, of course, of the fact that your head needs to be on a swivel if you so choose to fly through an alert area. I just want to read the last sentence there. Starting under all activity within an alert area must be conducted in accordance with CFRs. So you can see that, again, that's going to be the expectation without waiver, and pilots of participating aircraft, as well as pilots transitioning the area, must be equally responsible for collision avoidance. So if it's avoidable, just like the MOA, this is definitely still a prudent decision to avoid these areas. All right, let's go on. So next on the list is our controlled firing areas. Be aware that there's something specifically peculiar about these. Oh, hold on one second. You guys don't see my screen. There we go. All right, so controlled firing areas. These are particularly peculiar because, well, they're not depicted. So how do we know they're there? Largely, if you don't do the extra legwork, that is pertaining across your entirety of your route, you're looking at the airport facilities directory, specifically, I'm sorry, the chart supplement, old habits. The chart supplement's depiction for any information about a controlled firing area, you're not going to find them on the chart themselves. And that's because even though they're firing literally some type of live munition, that could be usually ground fire, but it could be beyond that. They're going to have some type of solution for spotting approaching aircraft. That could be a combination, or at least certainly one of either spotter aircraft, radar, or ground spotter positions to be able to locate and track aircraft. And then if that aircraft appears to be approaching the controlled firing area, they're supposed to be able to suspend activities immediately. So if they don't depict them and they're going to suspend activities immediately, why do we need to know? Well, it's still an inherent risk. We have human beings, of course, operating on both sides of the spectrum in this situation. So we need to be aware of the reality that they're out there. And therefore, certainly, if nothing else, we're equipped with the ability to go and investigate. This is one of the ones that I'm going to skip the actual aim and just jump into this particular example. So I didn't just pick a random location on the chart. This, in fact, coincides with an actual controlled firing area in Tennessee. One of the fastest ways, especially with the feature of a PDF search function, is just to simply, if you were in some type of chart supplement section, let's say you're in the Northwest or the Southwest region of the United States, and you've never flown there before, and so you're just wondering, are there any controlled firing areas in that area? You could always just do a search. So let's do that together.
Daddy, can I watch Paw Patrol on the Fire TV?
Yeah, you're gonna have to ask Mom, sweets.
She's going on, but she's with
Sweetheart, I kind of have something slightly important going on more than Paw Patrol. Can you ask Sissy?
Let her watch Paw Patrol, for gosh sakes.
Okay.
Portraits.
She has to do that every time. I think we'll expect that's going to be the case.
It's not Evan's seminar until Vivian makes an appearance. Okay, so we expect
much.
It is a great show.
Okay, so we're going to go to the chart supplement, and we're in the Southeast, and I have never been to the Southeast before, and I just want to quickly find out if there's a controlled firing area anywhere in the Southeast So I would just literally type that in and let the search function do the work for me. And it looks like, sure enough, surprise, surprise, controlled firing area of 5 nautical mile radius, 2,500 feet and below of the MKL VOR, 30-degree bearing at 18 miles, effective anytime Monday through Friday from 1200 to 2300 Zulu. On Saturday, it jumps to 1530 to 2230, and then there's a different time for Sunday. So once again, it's anytime in that area, so we don't know for sure if it's going to be active. We wouldn't expect it to certainly be active all that time frame, but it certainly could be active any time between those two times. So with that being said, you further equip yourself by simply just being aware of that. And once again, with that extra bit of foreknowledge, you're just extra cautious in avoiding that area in its entirety anyways. So you don't have to worry about depending on someone spotting your approach and of course ceasing the firing operation, which certainly, even if it is ground fire, it could be artillery, it could be mortar shells that could exceed that top altitude under certain circumstances. So why not do the extra bit, extra cautious, extra safe? Okay, let's move on. So this is one that I had never heard of before. Gosh, I don't remember when I finally found out about them. Certainly didn't know about them on my through my private certificate. I think I might have known about them by my commercial. Not too common. Anyone familiar with the background? Of course, this is Pearl Harbor. Generally, in that case, that's the monument for the sunken Arizona. So what are national security areas? They're not prohibited areas, which most people are familiar with, but they kind of are like a low-grade prohibited area, such that it's an area where simply we want an increased level of security and safety for some type of specific ground facility. It's probably not therefore super critical as far as like infrastructure goes, or especially military complexes. Like, for example, the only one that we have even close to Florida as far as the prohibited area goes would be the nuclear submarine base up near St. Mary's at Kings Bay. But it's certainly something that we want to protect, and certainly don't want a bunch of aircraft flying at low altitude over. Secondly, during certain times of the year or certain situations, these national security areas can by NOTAM become prohibited. And certainly, of course, then have the same level of structure and restriction as a prohibited area does. So otherwise, pilots are going to be requested to avoid flying through NSA. So let's take a look at another example of this. So let's actually go specifically to Pearl Harbor to see what this looks like. A lot of people can misinterpret this for something that kind of looks similar as far as the symbol that they choose to use. So we'll slide over to Honolulu, let my iPad catch up and let the video catch up, make sure you guys are with me. Now we'll zoom in here a bit. And what we see is a dashed magenta line, but it's a bit thicker than what we would normally see with a dashed magenta line, say that's representative of Class E airspace extension to the surface. In this case, if you were just looking here, you wouldn't have much to go on. And if you've never seen that symbol before, you may misconstrue it for Class E to the surface. Almost kind of like they want to protect that area, maybe for an approach in association with Honolulu, but then you kind of look and it's like, no, that doesn't line up with any of the runway, so that doesn't make sense. Of course, we do see a box to the north of the actual area that does give us cue that we don't exactly know what this is on its own. But we do see for regions of national security, pilots are requested to avoid flight below 5,000 feet MSL in this area. I've done some investigating or asking around as to what happens if you don't comply with that request, because again, it's quote unquote a requested area to avoid. Really don't know exactly what happens, to be perfectly frank, but certainly any reasonable person is certainly going to choose to avoid that area for giving consideration for whatever it is on the ground. It's not just, national monument type areas. You may see it over a munitions area, munitions dumps, large electrical grid systems, things of that nature. is where I've also seen NSAs established for. So otherwise, it's pretty straightforward. The good news is if you see that symbol, there should be somewhere on the chart an adjoining box that gives you additional information specifically for the key altitude that, of course, if you're going to choose not to laterally avoid that area, how to vertically remain above whatever they've requested you to avoid. Okay, let's move on. So military training routes. What's going on here? You can see that I was lucky enough, all the instructors may recall when we had the lovely T-45s flying through the area and how we were well treated during their presence. In this situation, what we see here on the right-hand side is it's not perfect, but you've got a target tracking generally south-southeast. It looks like it's offset, but of course that could just be misalignment with my moving map. But really what they're doing is they're flying along that gray line, which in this case is identified to us as IR-46. And if you can see on your screen there, you can see their altitude as well as their speed. So their altitude is 1,800 feet, and yet their speed, at least over the ground, is 359 knots. So if we do some basic math, that's definitely below 10,000 feet, and that's definitely beyond 250 knots. So what's going on there? Are they breaking the law? No, they're not. Military training routes are established to authorize DoD users or Department of Defense users to operate along those military training routes at low altitudes, namely below 10,000 feet, but we can expect it to be well lower than that, in excess of 250 knots. So this, in fact, is actually one of those T-45s that was tracking along that IR route at 359 knots. And not to call anybody out, but I hope whoever was in 422 Charlie Bravo was aware of that activity status. So whoever was in 2 Charlie Bravo on that day, you know who you are. I'm sure you called the flight service to find out the activity status of IR-46. So what's going on exactly? Why do we expect these to be utilized? Well, really, of course, if you think about it, military training routes are established so that military users can practice just that, high-speed, low-altitude flight, largely to avoid radar in combat areas. That's the key takeaway with this, is to be aware that if they're going to be flying along low enough to avoid enemy radar facilities, they're certainly going to be flying low enough to where ATC won't be able to always see them either. So the key takeaway is ATC cannot necessarily protect us when we cross an active military training route. And so it's really key to be aware of when they're active, and therefore in association what altitudes they're likely to be flying at. Most people have probably seen this video before, but if you haven't, let's take a quick look. I don't think I have my audio connected, but you certainly saw something flash across the screen there. Let's look at it in slow motion. Close enough. Just to back it up real quick, let's, for anyone that doesn't pick up on this, what's going on. This is a heads-up display, very low res, yes, admittedly, but it is still nonetheless some video of a heads-up display. We can see on the left-hand side the airspeed. So the heads-up display is showing an airspeed indicated at 350 knots. And on the right-hand side, you can see their operating level at 1,500 feet. Certainly a training flight, probably along an MTR, definitely along an MTR. And then, of course, as they're flying along, whoops. This is real time again. Now let's look at it in slow motion. You see that the pilot responds by trying to avoid the mid-air collision, but the slow-mo gives way to the fact that there's the pass and there's the response. So the avoidance of the collision was entirely by luck, not by any type of reaction time or by any kind of skill involved with the pilots. It just literally came down to just the slightest bit of deviation would have led to an actual mid-air collision. So this is the reality at these types of situations along military training routes, is that they're going to be flying at high speeds, as we can see, generally somewhere in the range of 350 knots or faster. And so we need to be aware, therefore, of how to avoid them. So how do you cross a military training route? And in association, what altitude? This is where we're going to jump back to the Aeronautical Information Manual. So before we do, let me scroll back one page previous just to reemphasize. We're going to take a look specifically at IR 46. So, and of course, that's in the western area to Orlando. But before we take a look there, let's go back to the Aeronautical Information Manual and see what that has to say as far as any guidance goes with these military training routes. Okay, oops. There's my house if anybody wanted to know, or where I live. So IR 46 is over here, and we want to find out more information about it. So we're going to go to the Aeronautical Information Manual, which, considering our present position in special use airspace, this is in fact found in a different section. It's found in this case under other airspace areas. So we're going to go back to chapter 3, but we're going to go to section 5 now, and then paragraph 2. So this is AIM 3-52. Now we're going to read all this together. We're not. We've already kind of discussed some of the things here. But again, our main focus is on how do we avoid this? Because as we can see, we are still really part of the equation as far as the see and avoid aspect goes. So the key takeaway is there are routes that correlate with certain altitudes in conjunction. And generally the key number is 1,500 feet. So under route identification, military training routes will be aligned with either IR or VR, identifying whether it's an instrument route or a visual route. In other words, generally whether they're going to be flying it under instrument rules or visual rules. And in a conjunction, we can see that under 4 number characters, so if we have a VR 1207, for example, there's no segment above 1,500 feet AGL. So that means that you would expect them to be flying the entire military training route below 1,500 feet. So the best thing, of course, obviously for you to do is if you're going to cross that MTR and you know it's active, do so certainly well above 1,500 feet. In contrast, MTRs with 3 numbers in accompaniment with IR, VR represent the fact that 1 or more segments is above 1,500 feet, which means that there could be a segment, of course, below 1,500 feet. These are kind of the red flags, if you will, because without further information that we really can't get without contacting some form of the DoD, and they may not give it to us anyways, we don't truly know. They could be above or below 1,500 feet. So what do you do in this situation? Well, if you're going to choose to cross it in the first place, if we look further in here, it basically designates that, at least from a visual sectional chart, we don't know the actual width of the corridor. All we know from the Aeronautical Information Manual is that it simply just states that these are several miles wide, whatever that means. Is that 3 miles? Is that 5 miles? Visually on a sectional chart, we don't know. So therefore, the answer is if you're going to cross it, you want to do so perpendicular. Why? Because that brings you across that corridor as rapidly as possible, which reduces, of course, the time of exposure in that type of situation. And while you're doing that, you may want to be looking off your left or right window, depending on which direction you're crossing. So that being said, if we investigate further, what we don't see is 2 numbers. And that's a problem because the route we're looking at, in fact, is a 2-number route. So what in the world is that? I have done my research and I have yet to find an answer for this directly in any kind of civilian publication. If anybody knows, let me know. I ended up having to ask someone in the military, and they were able to tell me that 2 digits, so you have to write this down. You won't find this, at least in the AIM. But again, if anybody knows, let me know. But 2 digits mean that the entire route is above 1,500 feet. We got an answer?
You could have asked me. I would have told you that.
Okay. Where's it at?
It was published somewhere, but I don't remember where. I almost think it was on the tab of the sectional chart.
What was the question?
where is it stating that 2 digits indicates the entirety of the route is above 1500?
Oh, I know.
Where's it at?
Aeronautical Chart User's Guide.
Okay,
Oh, okay. So yeah,
there's your
and
answer.
I think
so you would want to
it
go.
also used to be on the tab, on the actual sectional chart, paper
It
chart.
says in the Aeronautical Chart User's Guide that a 2-digit number is essentially have a 0 in front of it that's been dropped.
So you guys would want to go here to find that information. I will spare us the search, but that's ultimately where they're saying it's found. So otherwise, I had to ask.
And of course, that was Dakota
somebody
chiming in
to
earlier.
determine that for me. What was that?
No, that was
I said
Maggie.
that-
It's not Dakota.
No, Dakota was trying to answer it too, talking over me.
So in this case, if you're going to cross this military training route, and you know what's active, you would do so as rapidly as possible at a 90-degree angle. And in conjunction with that, you would want to do so preferably below 1,500 feet if there were no other complicating factors in that situation for why you wouldn't want to be below 1,500 feet. So in that case, that's the best option to avoid that type of situation. There are certainly military training routes all over the place. This is kind of the most famous one. If you get me for a progress check, you can be guaranteed I will ask you about this area because I always have a story to tell. And that story has to do with the fact that if you read in the sectional chart, it talks about unmanned aircraft or unmanned aerial vehicles. What they don't say, of course, is these are usually or sometimes can be cruise missiles that are launched across the state from the Atlantic to the Gulf. And it does have to do with that nuclear submarine base up at Kings Bay there. So,
Hey, Evan, I got an addition to that story. When they do that, they send an F-18, a dual seat F-18, and the Rio in the F-18 will monitor other traffic like us, and then we'll flick a switch, take control of the cruise missile, guide it away from the GA airplane, and then once they're cleared, turn it back on its internal guidance.
Yep.
We had a F-18 Rio that came through and did her instrument rating with us, Lona, and I was talking about this, and I'm like, I don't know what this is, and she told me exactly all about it. I'm like, oh, cool.
yeah, my side is I used to fly with the guy who was one of the last DPEs for 707 type ratings. And there was a company out of Brunswick, Golden Isles, which is, gonna get my orientation
A
here,
little further up.
right there. So they had a bunch of 707s that were outfitted to do contract refueling for military aircraft. And so, of course, it's so expensive to opt those airplanes that he ended up doing a check ride during an actual operation. So when it went active, they were in formation with 4 F-18s at like 24,000 feet. And then he was actually able to look down and see the cruise missile pop out of the water and take off. And then these 4 F-18s dove out of the formation and took off and chased after it. So I don't think this is used very often, but when it is, that would be sure exciting of a sight if you were crossing that area when that happened.
Well, and I'll give you another story because stories are fun. When I was running school up in Jacksonville for ComAir, we had an instructor out in that area over the St. Johns River, just southwest of Jacksonville. 7 o'clock in the morning, he said he saw a little jet fly underneath him, and he was at 1,500. I'm like, later on when I was told this story, I'm like, oh, that was exactly what he saw that time. So
Interesting.
pretty cool stuff.
Yeah. All right, so we've talked about military training routes. What I want to point to you is that you see quite a few of these converging from the northwest, moving through the MOA and into the restricted area, specifically in this case, R2910A. So we're going to talk about that, and I'll show you here in just a second that idea. But before we do, let's talk about what, of course, we can expect inside of a restricted area. Everyone probably knows that they can only fly through a restricted area if it's inactive, but why is that so different from an MOA? Most people on a progress check will usually struggle to differentiate for me what's going on inside of an MOA and what's going on inside of a restricted area. This is particularly critical to me as far as, once again, like I said before at the beginning, the reasoning why is important because it gives you further insight into you making a decision. I've talked about it before, I'll say it again. As an instructor, our responsibility to you as customers is to make sure that we become obsolete. If all you've taken away is, yes, I can fly through this, and no, I can't fly through that, but you don't know the reasoning why, then once again, it is a very surface level understanding, and it restricts your ability to see the picture in its entirety and make that critical decision. Now, yes, if simply all you take away is that you can't fly through an active restricted area, it's going to keep you safe, but you may start to say, well, I can fly through an MOA, so surely it's not that big a deal. Well, as we can see, it's clearly not. So the real reason, of course, why restricted areas are restricted in comparison is we move from high-speed aircraft that are distracted doing different types of combat tactics, and of course, now into a situation where we have a live fire situation. This could be ground fire. It could be surface to air fire, meaning like surface to air missiles. It could be air to surface missiles. It could be, of course, unguided bombs. It could be simply just a Gatling gun or a Vulcan cannon like we see here from an A-10 Warthog. Could be all different types of stuff, and certainly you don't want to be there. I have talked to someone who inadvertently flew through a restricted area, and his brother was on the right-hand seat, and he saw kind of a flash, an orange flash glow out the the corner of his eye, and he looks over, and there's a big fireball coming up from the ground, and they look off to the left, and there's a A-10 kind of coming across them, strafing a target, firing its Vulcan cannon. So these, of course, are obviously areas you don't want to be, quite clearly. Because of that, the hazard is now completely invisible, as opposed to it being a situation where you may, quote unquote, technically be able to see that aircraft, even if it's moving at 450 knots. So the key takeaway, of course, is that in these restricted areas, we clearly don't want to be there because of the type of activity. So let's go and look at the situation that I was talking about before with the military training routes now converging in a specific area. Okay, so as I was saying, we can see these military training routes converging from the northwest in through the Placa 1 MOA and now into R2910A. And this has been changed entirely, but if we take away the sectional and zoom in, you can see what was the remnants of basically a simulated airbase. They still kind of have some stuff going on there. I think there's still some helicopters that are kind of spread out along what used to be actually a paved runway. And it looks like, can't zoom in any further than that one, but that helicopter looks pretty torn up. Sure enough, as you would imagine, those military training routes converge on this area, and they practice strafing this area. I think this is actually a simulated village or town, at least it used to be. Kind of looks like it's changed a bit as well. And then, of course, over here, you notice quite a bit of cratering as well. So this is, of course, obviously, for good reason, is a place that you'd want to avoid. You don't see this on the charts. So sometimes when you're wondering what's going on, don't forget with a for-flight feature or any type of Google Earth situation, you can always say, okay, I see that on the chart, but let me investigate further what's going on. And if nothing else, it's a bit fun to kind of see things. So don't forget, if you're using for-flight, you can turn off the sectional, look at the actual ground to see what's going on there. And it just gives you additional validity to say, yep, I know I can't legally fly through there if it's active and they don't clear me through, but I wouldn't want to be there anyways. Now, one takeaway is that yes, you can technically fly through an active restricted area if you've obtained clearance by the appropriate controlling agency. So let's do some investigating real quick on R2910A as to who or what that is. So let me turn off my draw there. We'll go to R2910A with the for-flight. We can see it's from the surface to 20,000 feet. So in a normally aspirated single engine airplane, you're certainly not going to outclimb that. We can see the frequency would be Jacksonville Center on 134.0, that same Daytona Beach frequency, in fact, or that frequency for Daytona Beach. What about the activation? It's non-continuously, it's intermittent, any time from 8 a.m. to 2400. So once again, you check your NOTAMs from 8 a.m. to midnight. That doesn't mean that you're going to get a NOTAM for this activity. The only way to know for sure is by calling the controlling agency. The only exception, again, is if you were flying in the middle of the night after midnight before 8 a.m., you should expect to get a NOTAM by 6 hours in advance of that time if it was outside of that normal time frame. Otherwise, once again, you are going to have to contact Jacksonville Center, best on 134.0 in that area to determine its activity status. Best, of course, for flight planning purposes to just plan around it because we don't know And so it's best to already have a plan to go around it as opposed to a plan to go through it. And then suddenly now it's active. Even if you didn't expect it to be active, it could be active. And now you're having to retool your planning while in flight, which is certainly not optimal. All right, let's move on so I don't disappoint the 4-year-old. Warning areas. Quite simply put, these are no different than, for our purposes or our concerns, than a restricted area is. So yet, if we read the paragraph, activities, of course, are hazardous to non-participating aircraft that abound from air-to-air intercept training, air combat tactics, and live missile firing. As we can see, this missile being fired off of, I think this is a frigate. I don't know my boats. So why can non-participating airplanes fly through active warning areas? Peculiar. Why is that? So let's go investigate and go back to the AIM and take a look at AIM 3-4-4 and see if we can't conclude why that's an exception. Once again, this is particularly important, not just so we can say, I know because it's this. It comes back to not just knowing the legal, but knowing, of course, that even if we can, it's best to still, of course, consider what's most prudent. Now, the good news is if you're not familiar with warning areas, these are located off the coast. So, my iPad catch up there. Specifically, how far off the coast? Well, let's go take a look. So we're going to go back to Chapter 3, Section 4, Paragraph 4 under warning areas. It's quite short. So let's glean all that we can from the single paragraph. Warning areas, airspace of defined dimensions extending from 3 nautical miles outwards. So if you're not flying more than 3 nautical miles off the coast, you wouldn't expect to encounter these. However, depending on your as Spawn Command, the choice that you make as far as routing goes with types of flying in Florida, you could find that even flying from one side of Florida to the next could put you, of course, this far off the coast and therefore possibly inside of a warning area. As we already discussed, the activity, of course, is certainly hazardous to non-participating airplane, including obviously fast-moving missiles, certainly possibly supersonic activity. So the purpose, of course, of a warning area is to warn that non-participating airplane of that potential danger. Here's the key. A warning area may be located over domestic or international waters or both. Oftentimes they are incorporating both, especially where we're located. And that's the key takeaway. The DoD cannot legislate a restriction for these airspaces because they oftentimes sit in international waters or therefore in association international airspace. So that's the only reason why we're allowed to fly through active warning areas, is because largely there's no reason for them to be considered any different than restricted areas. The only reason why we can is just simply a legality. So what it boils down to is, once again, we should treat these just as a consideration like we would a restricted area and avoid them, which for most general aviation aircraft operations, that's usually not going to be an issue until it is. And what do I mean by that? Well, everyone, of course, probably anticipates at some point flying to the Caribbean or at least the Bahamas. Suddenly, maybe these warning areas do become an issue. And if you've never thought about them, you've never investigated them, and they're active, you know that you can fly through it. So what's the big deal? Surely it's not that big of a deal. Well, you may find, of course, that's more of a surprise than you initially expected. So be aware, warning areas will be treated just the same as restricted areas, and certainly be in contact with the appropriate agency. So no exception. If we go and we take a look at an example, say, for example, one of the warning areas that you may find yourself being considerate of. Let me turn off that map touch action just to streamline things. Warning area W497B certainly could be part of the equation flying to the Bahamas. So if you're familiar with ForeFlight, as you would imagine, you can, of course, certainly interrogate it with a press and hold, and you can see it's from the surface and above. So that's not very helpful. Basically from the surface to space. And on top of that, it's a wide-ranging area. You can see the good news is the activation is by NOTAM. Hours are by NOTAM, of course, obviously an association. And the controlling agency would be Miami Center. So when in doubt, certainly get in touch with Miami Center to find its activity status. To my knowledge, and as you would expect, this is probably usually associated with the space activity at Kennedy, but it could certainly be other things, maybe in some situations. All right, let's move on. These should come, of course, no surprise to most people. Prohibited areas are in fact prohibited, but of course, one key takeaway is, unlike most other airspaces, if you recall when I first talked about the base idea of airspace is that it's to separate participating and non-participating airplane. That's generally not the case for prohibited. It really does boil down to an area, of course, established for national security. Clearly, therefore, if there's no reason to separate participating and non-participating aircraft, then there's not going to be any type of intermittent time. There's not going to be any such thing as a controlling agency. It's just simply, it is what it is. And so there's no one to contact. There's no one to find out whether it's going to be active or not, because it's just always active. So it's just a block of no-go airspace. Certainly, as you would expect, this is definitely situated in certain areas in the special flight rules areas. So let's take a look at that if you've never looked at it before. Most people probably, if they've looked at a prohibited area, might have looked at the one at Kings Bay. And you might have looked at these before. If you haven't, let's just kind of delve into it, because at first, the area looks quite convoluted and a bit cluttered, and it's difficult to interpret things if you don't zoom in and take your time. So let's go back to ForeFlight. So what we see here is, let me zoom out just a bit. This is representing the SFRA, or Special Flight Rules Area, for the District of Columbia. If you're not familiar with what an SFRA is, that's actually another slide that we'll take a look at here in a moment. But specifically within that Special Flight Rules Area, you also have something called an FRZ, which stands for Flight Restricted Zone. You can see it's miscolored, and that's kind of intentional, because the idea is you really shouldn't be flying over that area unless you're authorized to do so. Specifically, if you want to fly inside of the FRZ, maybe you live in DC and you want to park your airplane at College Park, you're not going to just be able to do that after some study or even taking the required course that's required anytime you're within 60 nautical miles of the greater Washington, DC area. You're going to have to go through an entire background check, a certified background check that's approved for you to be able to fly in that area. But even beyond that, it still doesn't allow you to fly inside of those areas that we see shaded there. So once again, if I wanted to know why these are what they are, without even necessarily finding out the details yet, guess what? You can do the same thing we did before. Zoom in a bit. I lost my place. Let me go back. I don't know DC that well enough. This one's in association with the U.S. Naval Observatory. And if I zoom out again, if I can find my place, I can't, so I'll turn that back on. There we go. There's, as you'd imagine, of course, by the ID, there's the state, or the Capitol, and in conjunction with that, there's the White House. So surprise, surprise, the prohibited area covers things that, of course, we wouldn't expect otherwise. But, of course, once again, if you want to find out further information, no exception, you can interrogate by pressing and holding. We can see P56 is identified from the surface to 18,000 feet. And then, of course, as you would imagine, no controlling agency and no activation times, just because it is what it is. So this is the one exception as far as special use airspace, really, that is not purposed, I guess, other than national security areas, for the intent of separating participating and non-participating aircraft. All right, let's move on. So speaking of SFRAs, or Special Flight Rules areas, there are some areas around the country, not too many, that if we see a certain symbol, it immediately tells us that if we want to fly inside of that area, we're not only going to have to comply with certain restrictions, but in this case, not only comply with, say, normal restrictions listed in 14 CFR 91, but also comply with an additional set of restrictions set forth in this case in 14 CFR 93. Now, we're not going to go into those details, but the key takeaway, of course, is if you are planning a route and suddenly you see this symbol that we're going to talk about, you're going to have to get familiar, of course, with that additional set of regulations before you fly in that area. And of course, the background gives way to one of them, which is the Grand Canyon. So yeah, you can't just go flying in the Grand Canyon for the heck of it if you don't comply with the additional guidance of 14 CFR 93. So let's go take a look at that real quick, just to see what that looks like. Again, we're not going to delve into details as far as specifically what is required, but we'll at least take a gander at the area. So we'll zoom out, scroll across the country down to north of the Phoenix area. And as I zoom in, what will come into view is the same boundary that we just saw surrounding the capital. But now, of course, as you can see, it covers the Grand Canyon. So good news is if you see that bounded area, usually you're going to get insight, of course, into what's going on. Depending on whether I zoom in or out, I get, of course, a different chart. So without zooming too far in, you can't probably read it on your screen because I'm not zoomed in enough. But right here, of course, it's giving away that there are some additional flight rules, of course. But if I zoom in far enough, it switches a bit. And then, of course, we get real specific as far as the details go. So good news is most sectional charts are not going to leave you out to hang out to dry if you don't have a clue what you're looking at. Nonetheless, don't be surprised if you're planning a route of flight and you see some of this stuff out there. Probably more of it to come in the future, not less of it, where we have additional restrictions governing specific areas where they see a necessity. Namely, as you would imagine, what we have this for, of course, is the hazards associated with flying through the canyon at low altitude, and all the aircraft doing it at the same time creates quite a bit of safety issues in conjunction. While I'm here, I don't have a slide dedicated to this, but while I'm here, you'll also notice this line with this associated dot. That represents what's called a special conservation area. Not really considered special use airspace, but nonetheless an area where we're requested to avoid overflight below 2,000 feet. Now that's a request. In contrast, if you see that same symbol depicted in red, like it is here, it's no longer a request. Now this is not an FAA rule, this is actually a National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration regulation, but it's still a regulation nonetheless that in this area you can see that flight operations below 1,000 feet over the designated areas within Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary violate that regulation. So across the entire coastal area there, if you fly below 1,000 feet, you would actually be in violation of a regulation in that case. So it looks kind of the same. The difference, of course, being is the red color as opposed to the blue color. All right. Last thing to talk about, the other thing that I was supposed to pull that failed for me tonight is what is the most commonly violated type of airspace? Well, now you know that the most commonly type of violated airspace as far as special use airspace goes are temporary flight restrictions. Why? Well, just that. We know that they're temporary in nature. They're not permanently depicted on our charts. And there's a myriad of different reasons, of course, as to the reasons why that TFR pops up. Where can we glean what are some different reasons? Most people are aware that certainly anytime the president comes into town, there's a significant POTUS TFR, and that's probably the biggest gargantuan one. If you're not familiar, let's see if we can find it. I would imagine it's probably over DC right now. Looks like it is. So it correlates pretty much already with what we see there. But really, to break it down, you have a 30 nautical mile outer ring that restricts flights to basically only in and outs, no training, basically no types of operations outside of simply just moving inside and outside of that area. And even then you have to be on a defense VFR flight plan, which now can be filed through an international or ICAO flight plan, or you have to be on an IFR flight plan. You can't loiter. Again, no training, of course, certainly. And then the inside 10 nautical mile ring is completely restricted to all types of operations except for scheduled air carrier. And of course, DOD, that kind of stuff that would have a waiver, certainly for that. But outside of that, what other types of TFRs can we have? Well, let's go to the AIM and kind of find out some different reasonings to see why we may otherwise see a TFR. So you guys didn't see my screen when I was doing that. Great. Let's try that again. All right, repeat. Okay. So here's the presidential TFR over DC. Again, we have an outer 30 nautical mile ring. I'll just summarize this real quick. The outer 30 nautical mile ring restricts all operations except for basically to and from, as long as you're outside the 10 nautical mile ring, and even then you've got to be on a defense VFR flight plan or IFR flight plan. Nobody flies inside the 10 nautical mile ring unless you're a scheduled air carrier. All right, so now let's jump to the aim. Gosh, you guys are just letting me talk to myself here. I'm sorry. Okay, so we want to take a look at TFRs, which is now back to section 5, paragraph 3 in this case. We want to find out some other reasons. So we can see at the top, of course, as we'd imagine, protect the president, vice president, etc. But we could also see it established for protecting national disasters, like we saw during the hurricane disaster due to Dorian over the Bahamas. So anytime there's a national disaster, you can expect that there's going to be a declaration there. It's not just restricted to the state of Hawaii, by the way. Now I just tapped it all. 1 second. There we go. It can also be established for just generalized disaster relief to avoid, basically a complication with sightseeing aircraft congesting the area in association with actual aircraft trying to get in and out with relief either by people moving people in and out that need to be there, or of course cargo as well. Certainly we can see TFRs established for the space agency. So anytime there's going to be a launch, you can expect a TFR established there. But beyond that, one of the more common ones that we don't see published is a sporting TFR. And that's just straight up a normal application. So we can investigate the sporting TFR solely by looking at something called the NTAP, or Notice of Statement Publication. We're going to skip that and just talk about the fact that in reality, now what the FAA has done for us is any stadium that could potentially cause a sporting TFR to exist, we now are fortunate enough to have an existing depicted diamond. So you can see that over the UCF stadium there, or the Camping World Stadium there, you have a depicted diamond. And in conjunction, anytime there's a sporting event, in this case where the seating capacity is open and in excess of 30,000 people, from an hour before to an hour after the event, there's an automatic TFR at 3 nautical miles surrounding the stadium and 3,000 feet. Will you get a NOTAM for this? Technically, you will not. So what ForeFlight depicts is actually their own developed system to alert us of that. If you don't have ForeFlight, or if you don't have another option out there that's doing that for you, it largely is your responsibility that if you see along your route of flight, if your route of flight takes you across some stadiums, you're going to need to find out if during your route of flight at that stadium there is some type of event, and then in association modify your route if necessary. There's no absolute clarification on this, but much like the Disney TFR, from what we've gleaned and what we've heard talking to ATC, is that if you're in radio communications, and especially if you're on a discrete squawk code on your transponder, you should be able to fly through that area. But certainly when in doubt, it's best to plan your route, just like restricted areas, just like military operations areas that you may not be able to fly through there, and just make it simple for yourself to plan to avoid those areas in the first place. Otherwise, most other TFRs should have an accompanied actual published NOTAM, because those are truly, I guess, temporary in nature, where these kind of pop up and pop back down. They've just decided that I guess they're not going to publish that many NOTAMs for all the different sporting events that could be going on across the country. So be aware of those. Certainly establish for yourself some type of solution that ensures that during pre-flight, you make sure that you know what TFRs are going to be active. Most people these days, of course, are getting a standard weather briefing through ForeFlight or 1-800-WXBrief.com. If you're not presently doing that, I'd highly recommend you do. Or if nothing else, I'd certainly recommend you signing up. I'm not going to go into too much detail here because it takes too long, but certainly signing up on FAAsafety.gov. And what you can actually do is sign up for emails to be sent to you to alert you of pending active TFRs in areas that you have of interest to you. Now, what that won't take care of course, is a route of flight. It just gives you the areas where you're generally operating out of. But nonetheless, it's better than nothing. So certainly, if you're not already doing so, highly recommend getting a standard weather briefing every time from an approved source. But even if nothing else, if you're stuck in your ways, please at least set yourself up for success with getting emails sent to you directly. And if you want further information on how to do that, just contact me afterwards. I'd be more than happy to help you out with that. Okay. Before I go any further, I'm not going to keep everybody for the Class E, Class G variation session. So anybody that wants to head out is welcome to head out at this point. I know that airspace, especially special use airspace like this, doesn't keep people's attention for terribly long. Before you go, I will say finally, then my original question was what type of airspace can this take place in? So people shout out what they think this actual shot is, what type of airspace this is in. Anybody? Nobody?
MOA.
Restricted.
Okay. Restricted.
Warning.
Special use.
MOA.
I'm going to say it's got to at least be a restricted area, but it could be a warning area too.
Yeah, so this is in fact a warning area. It could take place inside of an MOA, but this one was just so happened to be a warning area. What this is actually a shot, of course, from the back in an F-18 from a fighter group out of Virginia Beach. What you of course see here is they're doing air combat tactics. So obviously high-speed flight type situations and accompaniment. Now, this particular pilot flying this particular airplane told me a story of one time where he was in an air combat tactic, not this same situation, but a different one, where he was in an inverted dive looking for his target at very high speed, of course, as you would imagine in an inverted dive. And luckily, out of the corner of his eye, he spots what appears to be a low-wing single-engine airplane, puts him through the airspace. Fortunately, of course, he saw them. Now, bear in mind that when they're using air combat tactics, they do not utilize their TCAS system because they obviously are entirely visual with their contacts. So they're just as hampered as we are, if not more so, that they're entirely dependent visually on their contacts. So you really, even though you could fly through that area if it was an MOA, or even though you could fly through there even though it was an active warning area, the likelihood of them spotting you is, of course, significantly reduced in these types of situations between the rate of convergence and the fact that they're distracted with the activity that they're presently undertaking. It's fortunate that he was able to see that aircraft. Now, was it really a conflict? It really wasn't, but it was very surprising that he spotted them in the first place. Not to mention, they're not too happy because they have to cease their operations until you exit the airspace. So they're sitting there burning that fuel, waiting for you to get out of that area. So even though you can, doesn't mean you should. So with that, everybody's welcome to leave if you'd like to leave. Again, I'm going to spend the next 10 or 15 minutes just talking about an important differentiation between Class E and Class G airspace, and then I'll end with that. Otherwise, everyone else, you're welcome to head out. I won't keep you here.
Thank you.
Sure. No questions, right? All right, for the rest of you poor souls that are sticking around, I'm going to drop off the slides completely and just take a look at one of the things that I oftentimes see on progress checks, which of course, you may even be able to answer the question of what's going on differently between the Class C and the Class G airspace, but the why usually comes up short. So, and one of the most common areas I usually see this on, of course, is the pre-solo progress check. But even during the pre-solo cross country, when we get into things like we see here, let me make sure that my screen is actually sharing properly this time. All right, there we go. What's going on here? All right, so what we see, of course, in orientation at Executive Airport is we see a corridor in conjunction with runway 7, and therefore we see a Class E surface extension. Some people will miss that. Now, why do we miss that? Well, because it's not very common. And so when things aren't very common, it's even more important probably that you ask yourself the why question. So when you're studying anything, don't forget to ask yourself the why and follow up to when you learn the what. So if you learn that the what is, it's Class E to the surface, don't stop there, because at that point, it's still very new to you. It's still very surface. And again, no pun intended, it's not very common. You're not going to see this Class E surface extension across the board. Where do you see it will help you identify, of course, some of the reasoning behind why you generally see it. So one of the reasons why we see it, of course, is it extends off of a corridor for an approach into an instrument airport, in this case, a towered airport or Class D airport. We see that consistently at other Class D airports like we see here at Patrick Air Force Base, not directly correlated with the approach to that runway, but pretty darn close. Same thing there at Melbourne. But when we move to, say, non-towered airports, do we see that very commonly? We don't, not too commonly, but there are some exceptions. So let's go take a look at one exception, and then I'll come back to the reasoning behind the why this is what it is. So here's two non-towered airports, both with Class E to the surface. Now, why did they do this? The answer is, if you really wanted to simplify the answer is they wanted to make these airports controlled. Now, that may sound like a paradox or counterintuitive to you, because how could they be controlled and non-towered? And that's just it. Non-towered doesn't equal controlled. Controlled doesn't equal, well, yeah, control could be equal non-towered, but non-towered obviously could equal also both non-controlled as well as controlled. Why did they do this? Well, really what it boils down to is we don't know the specifics, perhaps the reasoning why, as far as maybe there's an operation that specifically needs to have that level of protection there. For example, at Brunswick Golden Isles, there's a heavy activity of 707s, and I believe there's a big repair station there as well. But we don't know the specifics about St. Simon's Island. I don't really know them either. It may just be because maybe that's an alternate for a destination at Brunswick. Maybe that's the reason why. Irrespective, what does it mean when we control the airspace down to the surface? Or more specifically, why did we decide to do that? And I like to simplify it just from a really elementary visualization. So imagine, if you will, I'm old, grumpy Joe Pilot. Hopefully my pen works. It doesn't look like it's working, so I'm going to do this by my hand, so my illustration is going to be even worse. Okay. All right, so I'm doing this by my finger, so it's going to be even more terrible than it normally is. So here I am. I'm old Joe Pilot. Rules don't apply to me. I've been flying longer than all of you people have been alive. I know what I'm doing. I can do whatever the heck I want. So in this case, I'm flying really low. It's a marginal VFR to IFR day. Let's change our color for the cloud base here. So let's say that the blue, really can't draw with my finger. There we go. So let's say that the blue scallop line represents the cloud base. In Class G airspace, if I'm, say in this case, I'm at, I don't know, 1,000 feet AGL, and let's say that the Class G and E airspace differentiation is maybe right here. So yeah, I'm below the Class E surface, or the base of the Class E airspace. So I'm in Class G, which means all I need to have is legally 1 statute mile, and I just need to be clear of clouds. So here I'm literally flying directly below the base of the clouds, and I am legal. And I'm scud running to this airport over here, so we'll draw a runway representing our destination. Now, at the same time, at that same moment, there's an IFR aircraft, of course, on an approach in IMC, in the clouds, and of course, making that approach to that runway. So you see where we're going with this in this situation. Is this VFR aircraft scud runs right along the base of the clouds. I didn't really draw it properly to scale, but you get the idea. If that airplane is directly below the clouds, even though they are legal, it doesn't mean that, of course, it's certainly safe. And you have a complication where this is now an uncontrolled airspace. This IFR aircraft really doesn't have any technical way to avoid that aircraft. Maybe they have onboard traffic collision avoidance systems or some type of collision avoidance system otherwise. But if we're just talking about the true see and avoidability, is there really any way to truly see and avoid that aircraft? There wouldn't be. And that is the inherent danger in this type of situation, where if you have an IFR aircraft on an instrument approach and it's Class G airspace, they're going to have a problem possibly in this type of situation where both aircraft perhaps are technically legal and yet certainly doesn't meet a minimum specification for safety. So what you either see is you see the airspace Class E, of course, shifted from 1,200 feet. As you approach the airport, it drops down from 1,200 to maybe 700 feet, like this. And in conjunction, what happens when old Joe Pilot flies from Class G to Class E airspace? They, of course, are no longer legally able to do so. Because if we think about it, what are the differences between Class E and Class G? Really, there's not a whole lot of differences as far as the specifications for entry requirements. There's no difference between equipment. There's no difference for pilot certification. There's no difference for entry requirements as far as clearance goes. There's no difference for requirements as far as, excuse me, as far as, going backwards, is, yeah, I already said certification. Let's see, equipment, pilot, entry, certification. And then, of course, I guess I already said it, but of course, radio communications. So there's no difference except for, say, one thing, and of course, that is weather requirements. And that's really the key takeaway is, once again, as I said at the beginning of this, this session, the purposes of all airspace is to separate participating and non-participating airplanes. Suddenly, based off the conditions, this aircraft has to be a non-participating aircraft in that airspace because of the conditions, not because of anything else, not because they didn't talk to someone, not because they didn't have the right equipment or the right pilot certification, but because of the situation at hand, that once they fly into that quote unquote increased controlled area or protected area, it's now illegal to do so in those types of situations. And they would then therefore have to lower themselves to, as we know, be at least 500 feet below the clouds in this situation, in addition to the increased visibility to 3 statute miles. If that's not good enough, then of course the other option is to drop the airspace all the way to the surface and fully protect that area in its entirety. Now, what does that do? Not only does that change the weather minimums to operate inside that airspace, but it also changes the thing that this is the other question a lot of people miss, which is, my question is always posed at this airport, at this airport, and I'm just picking random controlled airports. And my question is, at all of those airports, what are the minimum weather conditions to be able to land or take off at that airport? The answer, of course, I'm looking for is 3 statute miles. What most people give us is 500 feet below, 1,000 feet above, and 2,000 feet horizontal. That's not incorrect as far as operating inside the airspace, but what it doesn't address is not only do we have to fly 500 feet below the cloud base, but that cloud base itself has to be a minimum altitude. And where do we find this? Well, we find this, of course, in the regulations. Most people have probably looked up 91, 155. So they've gone to 91, they've gone to 155. And most people pay their attention, of course, to the box or the table. But if you scroll past the table, there is an additional section. There's quite a few other things to discuss, but the one we want to focus on right now is this. So in C, we can see is accepted as provided in 91.157. What's 157? That's special VFR, so we don't care about that right now. No person may operate an aircraft beneath the ceiling under VFR within the lateral boundaries of controlled airspace designated to the surface for an airport when the ceiling is less than 1,000 feet. What in the world did they just say? Well, let's break it down. First of all, there's a ceiling. So that ceiling has to be broken or overcast. They have to be operating under VFR conditions or under visual flight rules within the lateral boundaries of controlled airspace designated to the surface. What did we just get through looking at? We just got through looking at Class E, which of course is controlled airspace to the surface. We just got through looking at Class C airspace designated to the surface. Without going on, you would imagine that all the airports that we circled, we have controlled airspace to the surface. And then finally, in association, then that ceiling cannot be less than 1,000 feet. Now, anybody not familiar with this regulation, you may want to ask yourself, when is it that you thought an airport, quote unquote, goes IFR? In other words, if you started up the engine, you didn't check the ATIS, you went to taxi out, you called the ground controller, told you like a VFR departure to the northwest, and they said the field's IFR, say intentions, what would the conditions have to be at a minimum to qualify for that type of situation? The answer you now know is a ceiling possibly below 1,000 feet and or visibilities, in this case, still below 3 miles. That's the other key takeaway. These airports, even though they're non-towered, now require that additional restriction. Whereas before, technically, you could take off from these non-towered, uncontrolled, if they were, airports with 1 mile and clear clouds. Now we have to have at least a ceiling of 1,000 feet, as well as 3 miles of visibility to take off and land, as well as, for that matter, even operate within the airspace. So you couldn't even fly through that area below 1,000 feet ceiling, even if you were complying with that 500 feet below minimums, or sorry, 500 feet below the base of the cloud. So there's 2 restrictions now that you have to comply with in that situation. That's enhanced protection for everyone, both VFR and IFR operations in those types of situations.
Cookies,
So,
everybody a little bit.
Say again?
Oh, sorry, I didn't realize my mic was off.
Oh, okay.
I'm
That's
baking
fine.
cookies. I'll mute
No
myself.
problem. So that's probably the biggest confusion that most people have. I am running behind. I wanted to talk about Class E shelf shifts like the one we see here. And unfortunately, this is getting even more isolated. I've had this conversation with quite a few of the instructors. If you don't know what this is, that's probably okay, because this is literally one of the last places I've found that has this designation. I need to talk to Ed, to be honest, to see if we're really even going to start asking this question anymore, because it's so isolated that literally this is one little tiny section of the border of the state of Florida, of Texas, that has this designation anymore. That used to be over the Sierra Nevadas, that's gone. It used to be near the Grand Canyon, that's gone. It's pretty much all gone, to where if anyone else has found any, please let me know, because quite literally, this is the last place I've even found it, and why they even did that, I have no idea. What this is, just for quick reference,
There's
this
some
is an area,
over the airport 13 Quebec. It's in, you can look for it there as well.
okay, thank the Lord, good.
Yeah, that's the only other place that I've seen it.
Okay. What this is this is actually an area where it's so remote that they don't need to operate controlled airspace at basically the highest altitude that they can begin it at, which is 14,500 feet. So in this entire area, on the darker shaded side, what it means is that in this area, Class E doesn't begin until 14,500 feet, which means everything from the surface up to 14,500 is Class G airspace.
Yeah, Evan, and what I would say in a level of expectation, commercial pilot, definitely expect them to be able to identify that. Private pilot, probably not, just because it's so rare anymore.
Yeah. So if you want to ask, though, specifically about, say, these shelf variations of the Class E floor, like these, if you're not familiar with them, please get in touch with me. I'd be more than happy to answer your questions. But I'm gonna have to stop here just because I'm running behind, and I don't want my 4-year-old to burst in and insist on singing to y'all. So, but any last minute questions before we sign off?
I do have a comment.
Okay.
That the Ask the DP seminar that I'm doing next Tuesday, there are about 2 of the scenarios that if you all paid attention tonight, you'll be able to work yourself through that scenario, because a lot of this stuff does apply there. And so you'll be seeing some more of this stuff come next Tuesday. And awesome job, Evan. Appreciate it.
Sure. All right, well, thanks for coming, everybody. Hope you enjoyed it. This will be recorded, and I will share that link with you in the next couple of days, as long as the rendering doesn't have any kind of issues. You should expect to see a link with a Dropbox for that. So again, thanks to everybody for coming. We'll see y'all soon. Please attend next Tuesday, the Ask the DPE event. That's obviously a great event. Most people that don't show up will probably show up for that because it's clearly a highly beneficial one. And then next week we will do another seminar, but that's going to be on Thursday. So I'll have a email out to alert everyone to that, probably starting at the beginning of next week. So have a good night, everybody. Thanks for coming in.
Tutoring, of course, I had some issues with the tutoring, I think, on Tuesday with the meeting ID being different. So I expect that all of our tutoring uses this same meeting ID.
No, the tutoring ID is like the 202 one.
Okay, because I saw a few different, like it gave me a,
Evan, any way we can just make it the 896007771? That way it's always the same. Nobody has to figure out which one it is.
Yeah, Zoom just added that feature. So what I can probably do is recreate the scheduled tutoring sessions, and I think that I can switch them over to the standard ID. Yeah.
Cool, thanks.
just let me know tomorrow which one you want me to use.
For now, probably just plan on using the 202 one or whatever it is.
Okay, the already scheduled one, no problem.
All right.
Will do. Thank you.
All right. Bye, everybody. Good night.
Bye.